But really our team does this in two ways, really from an operational standpoint. So the diversity action plan, developing that, operationalizing it, implementing it with our study teams to make sure that diversity and representation is really this kind of thread that's woven throughout the trial life cycle. And then secondly, which is really one of my favorite parts, is the community engagement and partnerships. And so really, how do we turn this externally to work with patients, work with communities, develop those relationships, bring them into the drug development process. So again, we'll get into this a little bit more as we go along, but just a quick intro about me. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Great, great. Well,
Rolando.
thanks, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Angel, great introduction. Hello, my name is Rolando Enoch, and I work for Kite Pharma, which is a Gilead company. And I lead a team or a group called Trial Equity and Optimization, and doing all of those wonderful things that Angel just mentioned. We're doing the same, and I think that's a testament to kind of where we are now. And I think it's great. And to Andrew's point in the introduction, we've heard these issues. We know these. We've been talking about them for 20, 25 years, and we are now at the point where we are actually moving beyond just talking about them and identifying what the problems are. We know what they are. We know what the barriers are. We know what the obstacles are. We know about the historical mistrust. And we have been talking about what solutions are. And so we are at that point now where we are implementing them. And then it's wonderful, as you notice, with my Kite logo and with Angel's Takeda logo, clearly we work for different companies. However, the mission and the goal is the same. And so it's bravo. We are finally getting there to help collectively move this needle in the right direction. And it's going to take us all to do so. So I am proud to say that again, while we work for different companies, so to speak, we are all fighting for the same goal and the mission. So, and I too am happy to be here. Thanks, Reuters, for the invitation, and happy to get into the conversation.
Great, great. Well, we've got the right people on this panel, that's for sure. So good job, Reuters, in putting them together. So what I want to talk about first is really a barrier that has persisted for years, um, and the question is going to be, where is the industry actually falling short right now, and what's driving sponsors to finally treat this like a design problem rather than an outreach problem? And I'll start by telling my own personal story. I've been a patient advocate now for 27 years. I co-founded the first colorectal cancer group in the United States called the Colorectal Cancer Alliance. And for the last 16 years, I've been running the global organization, the Global Colon Cancer Association. So I've been in patient advocacy for a long time. 6 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with a very rare form of metastatic lung cancer. And through her 5 year journey with that disease, we ended up trying to get into a clinical trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. And, I'm wearing my husband hat half the time, but I'm the other half the time, I'm wearing my patient advocacy hat. And I'm watching our attempts to get into this clinical trial, which required visit after visit after visit to New York City for testing and for meeting with different specialists and the trial sponsor and with the doctor leading the trial. It was probably a half a dozen visits to New York City. And each one of those visits was about a $30 to $40 toll ride on our Easy Pass. It was parking of $40 a day in New York City. Sometimes it was overnight stays that were $400 or $500 per night, and none of that was reimbursed because we were not in the trial yet. And then when you get into the trial, which she did, she got into this fantastic clinical trial. And actually, yesterday, you'll see that GSK's drug was approved for this exact form of lung cancer. The trial she was on got approved by the FDA just yesterday. It was amazing news for me. Um, but barrier after barrier after barrier. And I kept thinking, what about the people that can't afford this, that can't afford the investment of thousands of dollars before you're in the clinical trial, and then thousands of dollars more after you're in the clinical trial, because the trial sponsor gave you $275 a night in New York City to stay overnight for the multiple overnight stays. And where are you staying in New York City for $275 a night? So I put together a letter barrier after barrier after barrier to getting into a clinical trial and staying into a clinical trial. And that was my personal experience at one of the leading places in the world on a very innovative drug. So that really was my experience. But what about the two of you? Where is the industry failing in terms of getting people to participate in these trials and overcoming these real life barriers? Angel, you want to start?
Yeah, I can. So I guess I'm hesitant to say failure, where I would say we need improvement. And where I think, obviously just the fact that Rolando, both of our teams exist, and obviously we have other colleagues at other pharma companies that these teams actually exist. There is a recognition of the problem. So again, we're not going to, necessarily restate that, but I think there is this heightened recognition now that we have to bring the voice of the patient in. And for so long, we've been designing without the patient. And I always tell the story about a couple of years ago, and I won't name the company's name. When Juneteenth was kind of the Juneteenth holiday was kind of becoming more popular, and companies were recognizing it. There was a company that decided like they wanted to do something to honor the Black community, and so they decided that they were going to basically take their regular ice cream and just rebrand it with, I guess African colors. And it was a miss in the African American community. Not be, again, the effort was appreciated, but what would have been appreciated more is if you had actually asked, how does the African American community want you to recognize this? And so I always take that as an example of, perhaps good intentions, but without actually bringing in the input of those that you're trying to solve for or to assist. And so taking that back to clinical trials, yes, we can have the best, and we do have the best of intentions, but if we sit in a boardroom without actually bringing the voice of the patient in, we're creating solutions that we think works, and without actually hearing from the patient. And I think the story you just spoke to or spoke about, your personal testimony is a great example of that. Again, we're just not thinking of all the things and all the different people who may have these, different barriers, whether it comes to like financial, like you talked about with tolls and hotel stays and all that, but even just thinking about time off from work. And I didn't hear you say that, so maybe, prayerfully that wasn't an issue for you, but it is for a lot of people who aren't necessarily in salaried positions where they have, where they can just take the time off. Time off from work is also money lost. And so again, I think there's this recognition now that when we bring in the voice of the patient early, we're able to think about all of that. We're able to even, really look at our study design. Like, do we need to have all these visits? I heard you talk about 6 pre-visits before your wife was even enrolled. Is that necessary? And sometimes, yes, it is. But when it is, what can we do to mitigate those challenges? So I guess in summary, I think it's this recognition now, and really, I think our teams exist to help bring that voice to the patient in really at the earliest stages. And I know we'll speak to that a little bit later, but at the earliest stages to make sure that as we're designing, as we're thinking about this again, with the best of intentions, we're doing it from a very informed place, hearing from the patient.
Excellent, excellent points. And not only is there time off of work, you have a caregiver or two caregivers that go with you
Absolutely.
to these appointments that need to take time off of work, and then they get
Absolutely. Or
childcare.
childcare. Yes,
Child,
exactly.
I was gonna,
Yes.
yeah, I'm sorry. I was gonna
Yes.
jump in and mention that. I
Rolando,
mean,
go ahead. Go
yeah, I was
ahead.
just gonna mention that there's childcare, pet care. What about
Oh,
patients that
goodness.
have pets, and that they need to be
Hmm.
boarded? And then you also mentioned taking, I forgot the exact minutes, but I think you said maybe 30 minutes, 30, 45 minutes to get, from your home to where you're going. And again, and you were in New York.
Oh,
So
three
I think,
hours. No, I'm in
oh, three
Philadelphia.
hours. I'm sorry. Yeah.
three
So
hour
Wow.
drive each
yeah.
way.
So,
Yeah.
and that's another huge consideration,
Yeah.
and so, for us, we are, I'm in oncology, and so it's very specialized. And so, our ATCs or authorized treatment centers, they're typically at academic institutions, which usually are in major cities. And, so I guess the piece I want to add is, again, bringing the patient voice in, but then also going to where they are. Going to,
Yes.
we've got to be considerate of that, because 3 hours each way, or even one way, I mean, for both ways, it is a lot, and it is a huge burden. So, mm.
Yeah.
And
So,
especially like you mentioned in oncology, where you're already very, or even, in any disease where you're, very sick. Who wants to be
Yes.
in a car for 3 or 4 hours one
right.
way when when you're already not feeling well? So I completely agree with you.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So a couple of actually last year we were at a meeting with one of our pharma partners, and we were doing it a exactly what we're talking about, bringing the patient voice in early, and they were talking about a clinical trial protocol that they were putting forward for colorectal cancer, and our director of health equity flagged some issues in that trial. And the issues that she flagged was that they were trying to get a more diverse group of people into this clinical trial, and they thought they would open a center in Southside Chicago, and that that trial would just fill up because of the location. They didn't have a local trusted partner, and
Mhm.
they didn't include the patient voice before us. And what we note, what our director of health equity noticed was that part of the exclusion criteria of this clinical trial was diabetes, was high blood pressure, was high cholesterol. And she said to them, you have unintentionally excluded 60 to 70% of the
Yeah.
African American population of Chicago just in your trial design. And they looked at us like wide eyed, like, what? What do you mean? And she went on and explained that this is a big problem all over the world. And they had no idea. This is a major pharma company. They had no idea. And then we just learned when we met with them again at ASCO GI in January that they took that information all the way up and they changed that clinical trial design based on that meeting that we all had together. And we thought, wow, talk about impact, because you never know if you have real impact. But we actually claimed we changed clinical trial design, and what they were thanking us for was that they were going to fail, and they knew it once we told them that they were why they were going to fail. And what they said was that they would have had to go back and change that design eventually, and it would have then cost them more than $1 million to change a clinical trial protocol once it's in place. And that leads me, I guess, to my question to Angel. What is this identifying diverse populations early actually look like in practice? Because we've all been hearing about it for years and so many mistakes continue to be made. But what does it actually look like in practice? And what data sources or tools do you rely on when you're targeting these kind of populations?
Sure. I'm going to kind of, I guess, take this in two parts. Really, the earliest, when ideally, and then even early within a clinical trial, because I think they're two different things. And so I would say, like, early period within, in a company, we should be looking at, and we do, we really partner not just with my team, but also with like our community health, because they're looking at this kind of above where we're looking. We're looking at it at the clinical trial level. They're looking at it from more of a disease, health perspective. And so they almost, we work together to start to pave the way, if you will, and create this partnership in communities that we're going to. And I just want to be really clear. I think every time I every time I speak about diversity, always want to put the plug in that when we say diversity, we're not just talking about race and ethnicity. So we're talking about age, we're talking about sex, we're talking about socioeconomic status, geography, the list goes on. So I just wanted to kind of put that in as, as a disclaimer when I'm talking about diversity, but really starting to establish these, relationships and communities so that we're not going in and asking for anything. We're just going in to be supportive, again, bring disease awareness to communities that may not necessarily have the resources or the information or the education about it. And then once we get to the clinical trial level, bringing patients in and diversifying the patient population early is, again, like we've already established these relationships. How do we continue to build at the earliest stages? And I spoke about it a little bit earlier in trial design, like just like what you all did, and how you supported that pharma company. That's a awesome example of bringing the patient voice in early, because it wasn't something that they thought about. So, your advocacy team, your health equity person was able to bring that. And again, like what we spoke about with your example with, Memorial Sloan Kettering, bringing that, that voice of the patient in early so that we can mitigate some of those challenges. So we really try hard not to, and it's never ideal to wait until we're in the trial, we're recruiting, and then kind of and expect diversity or representation to be this Superman tactic, or this, to swoop in to save the day, to save recruitment. That's never the idea. And communities see right through that. They see the difference between true concern and partnership and a desire for partnership, and when you're just coming in with an agenda. And so the earlier you start, the more frequent you're in the community, because it's also not just coming in once and then we never see you again. This, I think the expression is early and often. This early and often, engagement is really what we need to diversify patient populations within our trials.
Yeah,
And the trust
I want
factor,
to
right?
I want to
Go
add,
ahead,
Andrew.
Rolando.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to add that. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Angel. She's spot on, and I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is it is incumbent upon us to build trust, to establish.
Yes.
And to your point, Angel, I mean, it's quite obvious. You can see through that when it seems like it's transactional, it's going to be a one and done. You're here to
Hmm.
enroll in your trial, and that's it. When we really don't know, what's going on. My pastor used to say, no one cares about how much you know until they know how much you care, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's so much more easy to accept that when there has been this history or this established, you're seen in the community, you're showing up, and
Yes.
again, you're meeting those patients where they are, and being intentional about it. Otherwise, it's not going to work, and this is all, and be reminded, this isn't just a overnight thing. You flip the switch and boom, the patients are gonna flood into your clinical trial to be enrolled. So
No, it's an investment
yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
And trust is, you mentioned trust, the
Hmm.
big factor, trust versus trial location, right? Trust location. So let's stick with you, Rolando. So now you know your target population sits. You know where they sit. How does that translate into site selection? Is it proximity to the community? Is it the site's existing relationship with the community? Which is the more decisive factor? And is there ever a trade-off?
Yeah. So honestly, Andrew, all of those things you just mentioned are very important. Location, the site. It's so funny often, and I'm gonna tell a personal story. Whenever companies want to obviously increase enrollment in the Black African American population, and they, like, oh, let's go to Atlanta, and then they go to one specific site, and I'm like, Black folk don't go to that center. So, and again, we tend to think that, oh, we're in that city, but we're really not, investigating and figuring out, well, just because we're here, where exactly are they? Where are they being seen? So we got to take it a step further. Again, I know this is probably the third or fourth time that I've said it, but going directly to the patient. So identifying those sites that are actually treating those patients or seeing those patients. And sometimes what that means is establishing new relationships with perhaps trial naive sites.
Mm.
I have a colleague that says, if you go to that site and they have, only 3 or 4 patients, guess what? You're going to get 100% of those patients. Because by virtue of the fact that they're trial naive, they're not competing trials there. So that site is prime for for the target. So again, being open to those types of sites, and really understanding the demographic, or what those sites are really doing and how they're performing. Often we like to, especially in the clinops world, we like to think high enrollers. Their site can get up very quickly. Yeah, all that's true, but what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing and expecting a different result. If they've never enrolled that population, what makes you think they're going to enroll this time? So yeah, they can certainly enroll patients, but are they going to enroll the patients that are necessary to be reflected in the clinical trial? So
Right.
No, I completely agree with you. Our team works hand in hand with our feasibility team. We actually sit under the same umbrella, which I'm thrilled about because I think that's a miss sometimes. Is really this connection between representation and diversity and feasibility. Because if you don't, you can create the best plan, you can have the best materials and all those things, but if you're not going to the actual sites that have the patient populations you want to enroll, it's really for nothing. And so when we look at it, we're looking at it not just, who does the site already have within their database, but then also who do they have access to? And really, when we start to think about community engagement, and I know, again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but when we get into community engagement, it's not just community engagement at the, organization level, like the pharma company level, but it's also really encouraging sites to have that, to engage in their community because they are that permanent presence. And so we work a lot with our local trial sites to help them build those relationships. And so, when we're thinking about, okay, if you're building these relationships, if you're out in the community, you're not just, pulling people or drawing people who are already in your database, but you also have the ability to pull in more. So we're really looking at access, for the site, their access to a diverse patient population, both twofold, like internally and externally.
Yeah, yeah, agreed.
And really, the only way to know all of this is to engage the patients and the patient advocates early. And, I've been around long enough to remember when we would reach out to a pharma company saying, hey, we see you've got this stage 3 trial that, you're going for FDA approval. Can we talk? And no, not till we have FDA approval. Back in the day, you wouldn't even talk to us until you had FDA approval. And then you're like, okay, we've got a marketing budget. We've got, we're going to launch. We want your help. And, we're ready to, and then it went to, we can't talk to you until we have FDA clinical trial design approved. And then we were like, well, it's too late then. It's too late to talk to us once you wasted, if you're going to go back and, like I've said, you're going to go back and change design, it's millions of dollars. Why didn't you talk to us in the beginning? And it could be anything from what we've talked about, cost to reimbursement to childcare to time off from work. But it could even be what side effects would you be willing to tolerate from this medicine? What if
Mhm.
this happened to your skin? Would you be willing to tolerate that? Or would you go off treatment? What if this
Mhm.
side effect caused you to be this sick for 7 days? Or what if you had to have somebody, there's so many questions that you can ask up front to know before you finish your trial protocol. And so I think about, what I learned from our director of health equity when she got involved very early and we were able to change the clinical trial protocol. And actually, when we heard that, she actually cried. She was so touched that something she really felt. They went back and they went to the scientists and they said, is it really necessary to exclude this and this? And they just lowered the temperature a little bit. You had to have cholesterol above this level. You had to have
Mhm.
had this bad diabetes. So, they opened it up to the regular people that are going to get this drug, and that worked. So I remember the days when we were just a checkbox. And now I feel like most of the pharma companies have learned that there's actually a significant economic benefit to engaging the patients early. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it's a smart thing to do. So, my advice to everybody in this webinar from the industry is listen to what Angel and Rolando are telling you that their companies are doing. And what this other company did was engaging us early, bringing the patients to the table. And it could be just a focus group, it could be just an ad board, or it could just be meeting with the patient advocates who have the pulse of the community. But use us early and use us often. And you will see that there's incredible economic benefits to the company as well as societal benefits.
Yeah,
So,
and Andrew, if I could add before we move on, you were listing specific things. I just want to add a couple other things. You're saying ad boards, with specific tasks. Engage with patients and patient advocacy groups as you're developing materials. I know
Yes.
having them review printed materials or pamphlets and to see if it's resonating, if this is the right language, something that we learned as we were, developing our multiple myeloma trial was we were always, previously talking about using the term caretaker. And a simple, words do matter. And for, multiple myeloma patients pointed out that we prefer care partner. I mean, something as simple as that. And so that is the language that we use now. Again, simple but powerful, right? So, in everywhere, try to infuse that patient voice, and engagement and involvement in, many places, as many places as you can think. So,
and the real
Agree.
question is, so when do we start? How early is early enough? And so I'll go to you, Angel, on that. So we'll come back to population mapping. as a sponsor, you can submit a diversity action plan as early as phase two, I think the end of phase two, no later than phase three. Um, is that early enough for the data to be, meaningful in shaping eligibility criteria, or does it need to be even earlier?
No, it definitely needs to be earlier. And so I am thrilled that we actually create diversity action plans for even our phase one trials. So all of our phase trials require diversity action plans. And the rationale behind that is like exactly what you said. We need to be looking at this. We need to be bringing the patients in. We need to be focused on diversity and representation, even in our phase one trials with the, limited number of sites, limited number of patients, like all of that data aggregated together makes a difference. And then when we think about engaging the community, it's again, as part of that diversity action plan, we're going out, we're already starting community engagement. Already working with patients, already working with communities. Because again, like Rolando said, trust isn't built overnight. And so we can't wait till we get to the phase three trial. Now we want to call on all the communities, come be in our trial, come be in our trial. And they're like, we've never heard of you. Like, what do you, this is our first time hearing from you. So we really, start early with the phase ones. And I will say, Rolando and I've talked about this before, like it's not an easy lift
Right.
always the organization behind phase, to do a diversity action plan for, a phase one trial. But I think I think it's really talking about and really emphasizing again the importance of the things I just spoke about, the benefits of doing so. And I think it's also being realistic. And so what I will say is our phase one diversity action plans do not look like our phase three diversity action plans. Again, we're dealing with a limited number of sites, a limited number of patients, and so some of the things that we would do, some of the strategies and tactics we employ for phase threes just don't make sense for a phase one. And so, we really, every diversity plan is customized. Phase ones are customized. So we're really looking at what makes sense for this. And so just to give you an example, like for a phase one, are we going to work with a lot of vendors and really do, a whole lot of, media and things like that? Probably not, because again, we're talking, a few patients, but really like that's where that site selection is so key because we have such a, limited number of sites. So they have to be the right sites. And then within those sites, after we've selected them, it's really working with them to make sure that they understand the importance of, enrolling or recruiting and enrolling a diverse patient population. How do we support them in real time to make sure that any challenges that they're experiencing, what do you need? You need different translations. What you need different materials. What does that look like? And so, like again, like the focus of or the I guess strategy in a phase one diversity action plan is going to be different, and maybe less than a phase three, but no less important. So really starting at phase one for sure.
Yeah.
I like that.
All about strategy. All about strategy, right? And
Hmm.
intentionality. I
Yeah.
think, Angel, I think I know I shared this with you before. I mean, my hat's off to you that you were able to convince to start as early as phase one. I'm not quite there yet with my, but again, for all the reasons that you've listed, I double down on those and just say, the earlier the better,
Yeah.
right? And every step of the way.
I agree with you both. So we're talking about site selection now, and Rolando, I'll come to you. Is there a risk? You see a lot of companies that you could argue over rely upon a small pool of trusted
Mhm.
sites that have good, strong community relationships. But is the over reliance to the point that you're slowing trial timeliness or things like that when you're trying to add relationships with new sites? Like, how do you build new relationships at sites that you don't have them yet without adding years to your setup time?
Yeah, yeah. So you can look at it that way, or you can look at it that, in the event that you don't enroll or meet your enrollment goal, your diversity enrollment goal, um, and you're slapped with a post-marketing commitment, that is even more money. So that's a whole nother discussion or a topic that we won't go. Again, it's kind of picking, which do you think, and then be reminded those costs aren't even you're not even anticipating those. You don't know what those are going to be, right? Or we know what those could be. but you don't know until it happens. So I say again, front load it, do it on the front end. But yes, over indexing particular sites. I mean, obviously it can be burdensome to the site, but again, so that's why it is encouraged to try trial naive sites. Again, don't certainly over-index with those type of sites because you do want to enroll your sites. But again, I think it is important to cherry pick or go around and to give a shot or an opportunities to other sites and not constantly going to the same site. Because again, we're back at where we were before doing that same thing. So, Angela, again, you and I were kind of chatting about that
Yeah.
the other day. Um,
I mean, it is because when you, I mean, it's craziness to continue to go to the same sites because essentially it's not just that, Takeda or Kite or any particular one company is going to the same sites. Everyone is going to
Everybody.
these sites. So these sites are oversaturated. And then we wonder why like it's taking us so long to enroll and why it's not working. And, because at any given site is at five different, maybe working with five different sponsors at a time. And so it really is incumbent upon us to to start to work with those community pharmacies, community sites rather, that may not have the same level of trial experience. And I think, and Rolanda, you started, I think, to touch on it a little bit. No, we don't want to over-index on those, but we can be creative with it. Like, let's start to think about ways to do this. And so, I always give the example, like if we're looking for 50 sites in the US, like maybe not saying like 45 of those sites should be these sites with less experience. Maybe let's up the number to 55. And 50 are our tried and true. We know that how they perform. We've been working with them for years. But let's maybe give 5 sites a chance and see how they enroll and start to build those relationships. Those sites need the experience and we need the patients that they bring in. So it's really a win-win for both of us. So I think it really it requires taking some chances, and I think it also is incumbent upon us to show some creativity in how we can do this.
Yeah. Again, I'll repeat, you have the opportunity to get 100% of those patients that are at those sites because again, they're not
Exactly.
competing trials.
Exactly.
And how do you cultivate the relationship with new sites though? Have either of you experienced that?
So
So,
yeah, I
yeah.
mean, and there, yes, we have, and I mean, and there are opportunities to kind of help coach and guide. There are actually lots of opportunities out there to
Yeah.
kind of do that. I think one of the things that we can do a better job of it, and we often hear about this, like in medical school, they hear maybe, I don't know, a paragraph about clinical
Paragraph. Yeah.
research. So it's starting there, educating there on what clinical research is and how they can be involved, and what that will look like. And then all of us attend different conferences, and congresses where we're meeting, the future leaders or those that want to get involved. At every conference I go to, there's always these new and green investigators that are, wanting to get more involved and engaged with clinical research. So it's starting there, starting with those relationships and then figuring out how we can partner and how we can support and bolster them up in order to be a good clinical trial site.
Yeah, and I think drilling into that, a little bit more, like Rolanda said, there's just a plethora of, training programs out there. I mean, I think everyone has a training program, for, sites that are interested in getting into research and, getting more experience. And so I think it's really recognizing like where that site is and what they need and pointing them to those resources. So, are they at the earliest stages where they need, more, kind of hands-on specialized training program? They need the nuts and bolts and fundamentals, or are they farther along? And maybe just need some coaching. And so, we are on at Takeda, we have our steady site engagement team, and they, really are the relationship builders with the sites. And so they're able to, having these conversations regularly with sites. So they're able to say, okay, this is what you need. We're able to hear what the site, like what that particular site needs. So we're not just making these generalizations on what sites needs, but excuse me, on what sites need, but able to hear specifically from that site, like what do you need, where can we support you? And so I think it's again that twofold recognition of where they are. Do they need this more general, training, or are they a little further along and just need more, you need something a little bit more, I guess, hand holding, if you will, to meet them where they are in the process.
Yeah, yeah.
But doesn't the industry feel that that's going to slow down the trials?
Well, I think it's what Rolando said. I mean, at the end of the day, like, and I'm grateful that, so many regulatory agencies are starting to look at this
Mhm.
more, and the need for representation, in terms of approvals. And so, it's kind of like, do you want to do it on the front end or do you want to do it on the back end? Because you're going to need to do it. And so, and we've seen time and time again, I know we've talked about this ad nauseum on, panels and conferences that, we keep going to the same sites, we keep going to the same sites, but those sites usually aren't the sites or aren't always the sites that have the patient populations we need. So it's kind of like, okay, if regulatory agencies are looking at this more and it's a requirement for, for our drugs approval, and we know that the sites we're going to are not the sites with the patient population, what do you do? And so you have to you have to plan for that. But I think the more we work with sites, the more we start to bring more new sites on, then we start to close that gap where they're not inexperienced anymore. And honestly, we've had some examples, and this is not just specific to Takeda. I've seen in other pharma companies who have some examples where less experienced sites, or these community sites that we were not expecting to actually enroll, have been some of the best enrollers and the fastest enrollers. It's like Rolando said, like they don't have, they're not competing with, we're not competing with, 4 or 5 other pharma companies and trials. And so they're able to really dedicate 100% to the trial, and really, and they also know their patients. They also have, better relationships or deeper relationships in their community. So it really aids them in being able to recruit. So I don't think that it's really the burden financially or from a time perspective that we often make it.
Yeah, and then I'll add to that, as we're talking about, is it going to slow down, and then what is it going to look like, post approval? Looking at it from that perspective, our docs are looking at the data, right? And I'll tell a quick story or give an example of where a doc stood up and challenged, the claims that this particular therapy is paradigm shifting and revolutionizing, and he simply asked the question, how can you say that when your data isn't reflective of the true population that you intend to treat? So I cannot confidently say to all of my patients that this is going to work. So it's essentially like passing the red face test, right? With our investigators as well, so that we have a responsibility and an obligation to be able to confidently, equip them to be able to confidently, talk about this therapy and its effectiveness. So, it's multi-pronged. It isn't just a matter of, oh, we're going to slow it down. It's going to cost us more because, we're still trying to enroll these patients. But again, let's look at afterwards, how is this going to impact our business, our bottom line. So
Let's shift to the actual recruiting for a minute. I think it's been well known that referrals from local trusted partners have been more effective than traditional recruitment advertising. So the question really is, what makes a referral partnership durable, repeatable across many different trials? How do you measure whether it's actually reducing barriers like cost and transportation and all the things that we talked about? And we didn't really talk much about health literacy, but that's also an issue.
So I guess I can start. So I would say, when we talk about, and I would say it's probably less referrals from trusted partners and more relationships with trusted partners.
Mhm.
So, recognizing that, the community may not know Kite, they may not know Takeda, but they know Pastor so and so, or this, community pharmacist, or, this community leader. And so, really, how do we thinking through again, who are the communities we're trying to reach? Where are we trying to go? Where are we trying to build relationships? And who are those trusted partners in those communities? Who do people get information from and actually believe it and receive it? And recognize, and understanding that, and not trying to go in and swoop in like, hey, Takeda's here, but really, how do we partner with those, again, those people, those organizations that already have, have that trust? how do we partner with them to how do we partner with them to actually start to build our own relationships in the community? It really allows us to show up when we partner together. And I'll give you an example. We just recently did an event at a community pharmacy, and I would guarantee you that probably 99%, maybe 100% of the patients and customers who walked through the door had no idea who Takeda was, and probably would not have engaged with us at all. But when the pharmacist that they interact with regularly, that knows their name, that knows their family, that knows their history, says like, "Hey, Takeda's here, and they want to talk to you about clinical trials and so on and so forth," and just kind of points them in our direction, it opened up a door that I don't think would have been open if we had just gone in by ourselves. And so that's just, a small example of if the need to partner with, those, community, trusted community partners. But I would say in terms of, I guess, identifying barriers, I don't believe that the barriers that, some of the barriers that you named are necessarily what we're expecting or asking those trusted partners to support us with. It's really not so much like support us with childcare and transportation and things like that. Like that's not really on them. What we're asking them to do is to help us to remove the barriers of access, awareness, and education. So help us to get into the community so we can talk about clinical research. And notice I said clinical research broadly, not a clinical trial. So we can come in and talk about what clinical research is, all of that jargon that we know because we live and breathe this every day. The general population, communities don't know that. So can we come in and start to unpack that clinical research 101, talk about this as a treatment option, start to talk about diseases that, affect these communities, build those relationships. Do we have that, can you help us get that access that we may not have so we can start to bring that awareness and education? So I would say access, awareness, and education are really the barriers that we're really dependent on our trusted community partners to support us with.
Angel, you smacked the nail right on the head. I have to say this. So I've been in this role at Kite. I created this team about 3 years ago, and we've yet to, well, it, we rarely talk about a specific clinical trial. Our work is really coming in to talk about, what is a clinical trial? What are clinical trials? What is clinical research? How you can be involved, how it could benefit, and the truth of the matter is, and how clinical trials, the perception is their last resort. And how you shouldn't think of it that way, rather as another option or potentially another option, and you can talk to your doctor about that. So I say all that to say, again, our intent is not to specifically talk about a specific clinical trial, as you mentioned, rather, again, what is clinical research and what are my options and things of that nature. So I think it's very important that helps with establishing the trust because again, you're not coming in looking to get
No
something.
agenda. Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
And I think
So,
to kind of piggyback on that, more, I think I've heard, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, like, is there other dollars there? Like, how do we actually fund this? And I think it's really looking at really making sure like your KPIs are really aligned with what you're trying to do. When we go out and do this community engagement, our KPIs are not tied to how many patients can we enroll in this
right.
trial. Because if that's the case, then it's probably going to be a fail because again, this is their first time meeting us. So they're like not likely to sign up
Yeah,
for any trial that we, were to present to them. But how many people did we talk to? How many people were we actually able to, drive to our patient registry where they can, get information, more
right.
clinical research information and information about our trials? How many materials did we give out? Like it's really, I think it's rethinking the way we look at our
Hmm.
KPIs, and it
Hmm.
has to be very different. Like community engagement is not patient recruitment. I can't say that enough. Community engagement is not patient recruitment. They are very different. And if we overlap those KPIs, we're missing the mark. And so we really have to be specific in what we're trying to do. What are the goals we're trying to accomplish? Should be very clear on those. And I think when we're able to articulate those, and we've been very fortunate that we've been able to articulate what our goals are when we do community engagement so that we're able to actually, get the support we need from a resource perspective to go out and actually do this community engagement. Because yes, ultimately, yes, we do want patients on our trials, but it's really, I see it as a funnel, if you will. You have to start at the top broadly, talking about,
Yeah. Yes.
disease burden, clinical research. And then as you build a relationship, you can start to drill down. It's a
Yes.
long game. It's a long game. And so that's what I
Right.
said earlier. It's an investment. It's an investment in this community that, yes, at the end of the day, yes, we would love to have you on our clinical trials. And yes, it would be great for you to be on them, but we know we have to start, top of the funnel
Yep.
and start to build that relationship, start to talk to you, educate you. Who wants to be on a clinical trial if you don't even know what it is or what it
What it
entails?
is. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think it ties back to what we were talking about before, and in terms of delaying the clinical trial for, and someone put in the chat, and I think this is perfect. And absolutely right. Oh gosh, where did it go? He said, here she said, Luke said, delaying trials may cost several thousands of euros or dollars per month, but marketing delays of drug may represent billions per day. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and again, that goes back to, can be tied back to the whole trust thing. And starting earlier, getting us involved way earlier. So again, we can bring all these things into consideration. So we could, again, be very intentional about trial design, site selection, where we're going, marketing, even though it may be a couple years before launch or however long before launch, but again, you're being thoughtful about it from the very outset.
Wow, really great answers there. There's a couple other questions in the chat. Let me get to them. First is from Montreal, Canada. It says, in some countries, clinical trial site staff collaborate with community clinics to support participant recruitment. These community clinics may be involved in separate observational or surveillance studies, but they help identify and refer potential participants. Interestingly, many of these countries are classified as developing nations, yet their community engagement infrastructure appears very advanced. They often obtain support from local government officials such as mayors, city councilors, and may even have community officers working alongside law enforcement to help protect study participants. And the question is, could a similar approach be used in North America? I understand that replicating the entire model may not be feasible due to HIPAA or PHIA, but is there an opportunity to establish relationships with other clinics, healthcare providers, or community health experts to support awareness, outreach, and recruitment activities for clinical trials? Woo!
Absolutely. That was
Yes.
beautiful. That was beautiful. First of all, thank you
Great
for
question, right?
stating that question and putting together all of that. Yes, absolutely beautiful. And yes, I think so. Now, I think it's also incumbent or we need to be considered the fact that, it's not a one size fits all, what works in one community may not necessarily work in another but absolutely. And I think that's where another major part of what we do is again partnering with those, and trying to go again, I'll take it back to where the patients are. They don't necessarily many patients aren't necessarily at large academic centers. They're going to their community doc. So yes, going there, partnering with them. I think I also shared with you, Angel, that, obviously oncologists, they deal with, all comers, right? And so they cannot be expected to know every single type of therapy that's out there and available, and be up on all the latest and greatest research. But again, I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to go out and, like you said, partner with those community, healthcare providers, be out in the community to share the information and make them aware, so they're aware of options. So, but again, I think that was a beautiful. Is it Angel? You want to add anything else to that?
No, I completely agree with what you said. Like, yes, 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 yes. The answer to that question is yes. Like, we would love to replicate that. And I think like there's different ways. There's, community health centers, there's community health workers. And so it's really like, how do we, it's kind of, I would say two different things. So one, like Rolando spoke to, and like we said earlier, it's thinking through those HCPs, those community health leaders or physicians and nurses who may not be actually in clinical research. How do we actually start to educate them about clinical research? Again, clinical research is like a blurb in this years long curriculum that they go through. So how do we make them inform? How do we get them informed and help them so that they are able to and comfortable having these conversations? But then also, again, how do we look for other ways, other people that can be in the community? It's really, I think we have to understand like we as industry cannot solely own the conversation with the community. There are not enough of us, there's not enough time, there are not enough resources. So again, and then from a trust, not even mentioning trust. So it's really incumbent upon us to look for, again, these different community partners, whether, again, they be community physicians, health centers, health workers, community pharmacies. Keyword is community, community-based organizations. Like, how do we work with them to help spread the message? Because really, to me, the first message, like we talked about, is what is clinical research? It's a treatment
Mhm.
option for you. It doesn't have to be a last resort. And
Mhm.
then, we can come in and help, continue to build on that conversation, but really just getting more ambassadors, if you will. And I think this is a great way, that question and that example is a great way to get more
Yeah.
ambassadors for clinical research.
Yeah, yeah. And I also want to mention, again, building on the research, as we're partnering with these, with these communities and the trusted partners, again, making it a deep, sustainable relationship, right?
Mhm,
Again, not
mhm.
a one and done. Only coming to you because I need to check this box or to fulfill this particular thing. No,
Yes,
we want a deep, sustained relationship. So, going in it with that mindset certainly is helpful.
agree.
So there's so many good questions in the chat. I'm having a hard time picking which one to ask next, but I like this one. And we're running out of time. Unfortunately, we won't get to them all. I fear for all the misuse of AI. We know that AI is based on historical insights. And actually, I'll add to this question. AI incorporates the inequities in our health system. I think that's pretty well known and not debatable anymore. Um, so the question is that we know that AI is based on historical insights, and we're using it more and more to plan trials, plan feasibility. Do you see a danger that we might become so data driven instead of data informed that in the end, as pharma companies, we're all focused on the same sites and the same communities?
I can start with that one. So, yes, I think if we were to rely exclusively on that approach, then yes, absolutely. I can only speak for us. Like that is not our approach. Yes, we want to work smarter. So yes, we do. AI is a part of our processes, and we're leveraging it more, but particularly from a feasibility, like that's really where like my team comes in. So we are in that feasibility process, we're not just reviewing the proposed site list after the feasibility team's already put it together, but we're also proposing sites because
Yeah.
like Rolando said, we're going to conferences where sites are reaching out to me on LinkedIn. We hear about new sites all the time. Sites want to, especially these community sites that may not have participated in a lot of trials but have access to the patient populations we're trying to reach. They're reaching out, they want to get involved, they want to be on the trials, and so we actually pick up the phone. It's a novel idea in this day and age, but we hop on a call and actually have a conversation to understand their site. Who is your patient population? What kind of trials can we do? And then we're able to, again, like not just my team from a trial representation perspective is not just reviewing this list like, oh yeah, this is a good site, yeah, 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 but we're also able to say like, hey, what about this site? This site might not be on the list, but this site is located in this area. This is their patient population. Really like not just, I guess, amplifying, if you will, but really like starting to actually make a case for these sites and adding them to the site list, and then continuing to walk along in the site selection process to highlight why this site might be a good fit. So I think we can't rely solely on AI. I think AI does help us, and there's definitely efficiencies there. But it's also, again, that relationship and that conversation and understanding, particularly when it comes to these less experienced, community sites. It's really like actually, again, having conversation, understanding their capabilities so that we can actually start to bring them into our site lists and our
Yeah,
feasibility.
yeah, yeah. And so what I'll add to that, I know we're almost at time, is that as with everything, AI is a starting point, right?
Hmm.
And and I'll have to use my father-in-law. I'm gonna pick on him for a quick second. He thinks that AI is just gonna wipe out all jobs. No, humans are not gonna. I'm like, No, 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 no. So, but even in this example, it's a starting point, but there still needs to be a human eye, human touch to refine and to better understand. And the to the point about data driven versus data informed, I think at the end of the day, we're all, we're steeped in data. Some of us are trained scientists. I'm a trained scientist. So again, and then we've got those from the clinical and medical perspective. But again, it's all this decision driven by data. And I think that's great, and it goes beyond just a feeling or a thought. But we have the data to prove it and back it up. So again, I think that's important. So I know my team, that's how we do. We conducted landscape analysis that is steeped in the data, so then we can help make informed decisions when it comes to site selection. Again, we're just not going to, oh, we're in Atlanta, oh, just throw a dart and pick. No, 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 no. What is the data showing us? So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Well, you guys have been fantastic. Unfortunately, we have so many more questions to get to. There's dozens of them. It's amazing, but we don't have any more time, unfortunately. I'll ask one more question of my two esteemed panelists here. What does success look like in 18 months?
Wow.
Ah, I guess let me try to jump in and answer quickly. I would say success, I don't think in 18 months we'll have it figured out by any means, but I think success is continuing to move the needle, continuing to bring patients, bring in the patient voice, continuing to partner with the community. And I say community broadly in all the areas we talked about, health, health workers, pharmacies, organizations, bringing the community into clinical research early and often.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say, just Angel said, continue to move the needle, but again, moving beyond just the conversations and actually implementing. Again, we all know answers and how to do, so let's just do it. So I think that's what success looks like in 6, 8, 12, 16, 18 months. Just continuing to go.
Angel, Rolando, you're superstars. Thank you both so much for your time, for your expertise, for your insights. Superstars. Look at all the questions that came in. Everybody they've loved your presentations and your knowledge and your delivery. So congratulations to you. I want to thank you both. I want to thank Reuters for inviting me to moderate this panel and thank all of you for attending. This was recorded and it will be available if you want to share it or rewatch it over and over and over. I'm sure you do. But thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.